Every now and then, I'll come across a game with a narrative so striking that I'm left thinking about it days, weeks, months, or even years later. A game with a narrative so well constructed and executed that any flaws in the gameplay are easy to overlook. The last title I played evoking this type of praise was Nier Automata, and before that, The Last of Us. Both of those titles were special for different reasons. Nier for its existential questions and storytelling format only a video game could provide, and The Last of Us for showing the industry that high-quality, emotional, and mature stories not only can be commercial successes, but can rival other media in scope and quality. I've played plenty of titles deserving of praise for their storytelling. In fact, some of my favorite games of the last 5 years are my favorite because of their amazing narratives, but it's unlikely for a video game to elevate itself into that rarefied air of a masterpiece. It's even rarer still for a game to rival the likes of other juggernauts in the genre it inhabits, regardless of medium. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is such a game. It's not for everyone, but like with most masterpieces, it wasn't designed to be that way. There's an earnestness present from the opening scenes that reverberates all the way to the closing cinematic. This is Vanillaware's flag planted on the hill of other great storytellers, and I truly hope this is just the beginning for this new direction. I have a feeling 13 Sentinels will go down as one of the greatest narrative-driven games, and it will be completely missed by the general gaming community, an underappreciated gem that will gain a following as time moves forward. I highly recommend 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, even though most people won't play it.
I should kill you right here.
I know the Sentinel like the back of my hand, and I have no problem taking it to the front lines.
No one else knows what's coming. It has to be us.
Many people fell victim to you. That much is still true. That's why I have to destroy you here and now.
Friends are pointless. They'll all be toast once the end comes. Being alone is the most logical solution.
Is this how I die? Alone. Wasting away.
Maybe just a schoolgirl. But now, I'm a schoolgirl with a giant robot!
The people at Vanillaware are wizards. The first time I played Odin Sphere, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Yes, it was 2D in an era prolific with 3D titles like Final Fantasy X and Metal Gear Solid 2, but damn if Odin Sphere didn't hold its own. This amazing art style and implementation is omnipresent in 13 Sentinels. The amount of detail poured into each scene is stunning. Light plays in realistic ways in a variety of manners, from dancing on clothing to a setting sun sparkling on skyscrapers to the unique glow of a CRT television. No moment is too mundane to avoid the fantastical brushstrokes of the art team. Movement is another key component. People mill around and vehicles putter through intersections. Streetlights cast eerie shadows on pedestrians. Lumbering movements of the Sentinels demonstrate their strength and massive scale. The animation of all the characters is both smooth and charming. It retains that anime essence of limiting the number of frames used to convey actions, which lends more credence to the handcrafted feel of everything. The presentation throughout Remembrance, the visual novel portion of the game, is full of memorable landscapes, but unfortunately combat did not get the same treatment. Battles are played out on a huge 2-kilometer square section of a city. With the camera so zoomed out, it would be difficult to discern sentinels and enemies. However, I don't think that's an excuse for the style chosen. Instead of seeing detailed models of the mechs, buildings, and kaiju, the player gets to look at what I can only describe as neon light-filled Lego blocks stacked into a rough outline of what they need to represent. It is fully in the realm of function over form. I honestly think it looks unfinished. With everything else in the game appearing beyond polished, a simplistic style like this one stands out in a bad way. Granted, there are times the crude polygonal forms help to discern what's going on, similar to Geometry Wars' excellent use of color and basic shapes, but I can't help but feel there was another way to do this. This lack of artistry is especially apparent when examples of the Sentinels using crazy armaments can be seen in the upgrade screens and a select few cutscenes. I long for a game looking like that. A small note, I do think there is an in-universe explanation for this simplistic style, but as a player, I'd rather see something more akin to Remembrance's excellent presentation. Despite the critiques I just flung at the art team, there is no denying how beautiful the game can look during its visual novel moments. It's rare I sit and ponder a scene wondering how a developer pulled off a particular look, but I did it often while playing 13 Sentinels. One brief aside before moving on, I thoroughly enjoyed the character designs of everyone but one particular character. I won't say their name, but I think the clips I'm playing say it all. The design is out of place and over-sexualized, not uncommon in previous Vanillaware titles, but I found this egregious and distracting when everyone else is dressed like Japanese high schoolers. Moving on. The music is headed up by Hitoshi Sakimoto and his studio group Bratphonics. If you don't know who Hitoshi Sakimoto is, then you are missing out on a brilliant composer. He is best known for his work on Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy XII, but his portfolio is pretty much amazing across the board. My dude knows what he's doing. The soundscape of 13 Sentinels is remarkable. Not only is the OST gigantic with 83 tracks, but it is varied. The opening track of the game, Brat Overflow, sets the tone with melodic vocals backed by electronica, but the game will quickly jump between quiet string sets to booming house tracks. There's something here for fans of all styles of music. I generally write my scripts to the OST of the game I'm covering, and listening to this one was a real treat every time I booted it up. Here is a small sample of some of the tracks I enjoyed. As for the voice acting, 13 Sentinels offers both English and the original Japanese. I'm not going to debate on which is better, but after completing my playthrough using primarily the English dub, I have no complaints. All of the actors do a commendable job, with no one sticking out in any meaningful way, which I think is good for an ensemble cast like this one. While there is some contention within the community on a few translation choices, I didn't find anything I came across to be confusing or detrimental to the story. Hats off to the translation team, especially considering the story's complexities and volume. Overall, 13 Sentinels is one of the finest looking games I've played, with an excellent soundtrack and great voice acting.
Can you blame me? Giant robots, fights in the city? I was on the edge of my seat.
You sure love mecha, don't you, Juro?
With a narrative structure as complex as 13 Sentinels, one might expect gameplay to be equally quizzical, but this is far from the case. The game begins with a very straightforward, albeit long tutorial, which goes into great detail explaining how the three main sections of the game will work. Let's briefly go over each one and how pacing can be affected by the way the player chooses to navigate these different areas. Remembrance is related to the narrative. Here the player will take control of one of the 13 main characters, and each one has a fully realized story. Upon selecting one of them, the player is dropped into whatever scenario that character finds themselves. For example, Juro Kurabe starts his journey in 1980s Japan. Meanwhile, Takatoshi Hijiyama begins in the throes of World War II. Their varying perspectives and eras can be jarring, especially in the beginning, but as the story coalesces, I found myself looking forward to wherever or whenever the tale took me next. During these sequences, the player can access a thought cloud of the character they inhabit. Interesting ideas, concepts, or items will be displayed here, and the player can see what the character thinks about them. In some instances, these thoughts or items can be used in conjunction with another character on screen to gather more information or perform an action. At first, I thought this might play out like a mini detective game, with the player piecing together disparate elements to find the right questions, but that's not really the case for most of the stories. Unlike some moments in Odin Sphere, 13 Sentinels doesn't contain hidden side stories or secret pathways to new scenes. Despite its non-linear nature, the story pathways are fairly straightforward and boil down to simply investigating everything in the thought cloud until something new occurs. I won't lie, I found this pretty disappointing, but it's a minor complaint in the grand scheme of the game. All that said, there are some stories which highlight a particular flow in the narrative, such as Ogata continuously reliving a 2-minute span of time hunting for clues. Not all of these departures work, but when they do work, it's a real treat.
A lone alien left behind by a UFO. Being pursued by relentless men in black. Its only hope is to be rescued by one chosen Earthling. Man, what a story that would be.
The other gameplay feature of note in Remembrance is how new stories unlock. If the player progresses, characters will become available and others may seal away. Those that are locked will have certain conditions related to battle milestones or other character arcs. These stops are in place to prevent the player from progressing too far in one pathway without gathering the requisite knowledge to make sense of what they're observing. It's a clever way to make the player mix up characters and battles while making sure the story isn't too nonsensical. To help the player keep track of all the events in Remembrance, the analysis portion of the game provides two useful tools, a timeline of events and an index. The timeline is exactly what it sounds like, a list of events played out in the order in which they occur. This can be sorted by character or time frame. It's an excellent shorthand for catching up if you haven't played for a bit or making connections between events you haven't seen in a while. I've definitely used this tool. Because the game is fairly long and dense with information, I forgot events that occurred over 10 hours ago. Being able to rewatch a particular occurrence or read a synopsis helps keep story threads fresh. The index contains information on specific characters, locations, enemies, and more. The data presented will evolve as the story moves ahead. Most of the index is locked behind memory points, which are earned by doing battles and completing story sequences. As these logs get updated, new information will be highlighted or altered based on what happened. I referenced the index more than anything else during my playthrough. Connections clouded in my mind would clear up after reading a few logs. As dense as everything appears in the analysis section, I definitely recommend becoming familiar with it if you intend to sort through the narrative. The last part of gameplay in 13 Sentinels is destruction, and this is arguably where the bulk of more traditional gameplay occurs. Destruction is a series of battles taking place within a set time frame. Because of its temporal placement, I found myself hopping back and forth between Destruction and Remembrance as I slowly pieced together the full story. These battles are against an unknown enemy force of kaiju. These monsters all have varying abilities, stats, and weaknesses that will need to be exploited by our group of teenage heroes. Like any good strategy game, preparation for battles is just as important as the fight itself. When booting up any given wave, a lot of information is thrown at the player. Enemy types, mission and bonus objectives, pilot status, and upgrade screens are all readily available. Choosing which pilots and sentinels to bring to the fight, as well as how many, can make or break the squad. Each battle has a limited number of slots for offense and unlimited for defense. In the world of 13 Sentinels, pilots suffer when they control their mechs, so anytime a pilot is used twice in an offensive capacity, they must recuperate from the ordeal. Managing workload is crucial to having the right mechs available for the right missions. There are 4 Sentinel types, with each one providing different abilities and base stats. Type 1s, for example, are great at CQC and dealing high damage to single targets. However, their mobility is limited and they can struggle against flying enemies. Type 2s are great for support and provide decoys and automated turrets. I think you get the idea that each mech provides a unique role. Each of the mech types generally share the same equipment but can be customized as desired. A Type 1 could be designed specifically to take out large, high HP targets, but at the expense of defense. On the other side, a Type 1 can also be turned into a monstrous tank, aggroing every combatant in the area. How the player decides to deck out each of the Sentinels both individually and as a group can greatly impact the effectiveness of any given team created. Pilots also have unique abilities or passive boosts. As pilots level up, they will unlock traits which can enhance combat effectiveness. For example, a character like Natsuno, who participates in track and field, benefits from moving before attacking. There are a lot of different traits and pilot relationships that can take a squad from B tier to A or even S tier. As for the actual combat, everything is pretty simplistic despite how hectic the battlefield can appear at times. In the center of the map is the Aegis, a terminal of sorts that must be protected from the rampaging kaiju. A countdown of 2 minutes triggers the beginning of combat, and as long as the Aegis survives or all the kaiju are defeated, the player wins. Kaiju arrive in waves with a small amount of time in between to prepare or reposition. The Sentinels brought into battle can use their weaponry to disable or destroy the enemy. Different weapons will have different areas of effect, penetration properties, damage amounts, energy costs, and cooldowns. High damage attacks will drain a Sentinel of energy and require the mech to work harder to stay cool. Balancing when and what weapons to use is often the difference between getting a good rank or not. Speaking of ranks, 13 Sentinels will score the player based on performance, how many battles in a row are completed before resting, and any other multipliers applied. It is at this point that I have some negatives to present. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is a very, very easy game to achieve S tier ranks with all bonus objectives completed. I played on Intense, this game's version of hard difficulty, almost from the beginning, and had no struggles beating the entire game. That's not to say I didn't go back to play older waves that I didn't quite get S tier my first try, but there were no instances of needing more than 2 or 3 tries to master a level. This is incredibly disappointing to me. Considering how difficult previous Vanillaware titles can be on harder modes, I expected something similar here, but alas, it's not meant to be. Veterans of tactical or strategic RPGs will breeze through destruction without pause. Newbies may find some challenge here, but I don't foresee that challenge extending far into the main campaign. Overall, considering how fun the concept of 13 Sentinels combat is, and the fact that this is Vanillaware's first attempt at a RTS RPG style game, I'd say the combat is slightly above average in both complexity and challenge. The biggest problem I have with it is simply wanting more. More levels, more mech types, more weapons, and more difficulty options. Even something as simple as boosting an enemy's HP to the max could prove to enhance the gameplay found here. I'm reluctant to say combat isn't fun, because it definitely can be, but the lack of pushback from these supposedly powerful kaiju limits my enjoyment. Your mileage may vary, however.
Next move. Good timing. That easy. How many down?
Okay, let's do this. How's that? That ought to do it.
Combining Remembrance, Analysis, and Destruction can result in some uneven pacing and gameplay. I say can because the player does have quite a bit of freedom in choosing what to tackle and when. There were times I powered through large sections of the narrative or took on kaiju over and over in the streets of Ashitaba. There's really no wrong way to approach 13 Sentinels, but freedom to choose does bring consequences. There were moments of story fatigue where the game forced me to play through large chunks of the narrative because of blocks put on battles or characters I actively pursued. While I never found this detrimental, I can see how someone not fully invested in the story might check out early because the character they wanted to follow got barred behind some seemingly arbitrary locks. Looking back on these moments when I felt like taking a break because my path was blocked, I can understand why the developers made that choice for narrative cohesiveness, but that doesn't make the stoppages any more enjoyable. I'm not entirely sure how this could be avoided without losing the impact of discovering the game's secrets at, generally, your own pace. In summation, I guess I would caution new players regarding the pacing. The player has a lot of control here, so if the story or combat seems to push too hard in one direction, it may be because the player needs to spread out the playing time more. I recommend playing in whatever way is comfortable, but be wary of story or combat fatigue.
Half a year I've been searching for you. Half a year thinking of what I'd say to your face.
I got you some yakisoba-pan. You didn't get any yesterday, right?
You got yakisoba-pan for me? Hey, look, that's not the point.
Much like I did with Kena Bridge of Spirits, I'm going to break up this section of the video into two parts. The first section will be spoiler-free, and the second will include spoilers, as it's difficult to give full impressions and discuss the themes presented without digging below the surface. A warning will be displayed for those who wish to skip. The story of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is complex while experiencing it, and only slightly less so when finished. Playing through this game reminded me of the first time reading Dune by Frank Herbert. Dune, both the original novel and subsequent series, does not hold the reader's hand as it delves into its themes, characters, and conflicts. There are resources available to reference, and Frank Herbert expected people to use those resources rather than guide the reader with a naive character or through exposition. 13 Sentinels does pretty much the same thing, although not to the same extent as the aforementioned book series.
Easy, take your time.
Proper nouns will spill from characters as if they were stabbed multiple times with a sharpened narrative device. This intense in media res will push less adventurous or critically minded players away. I don't say that as a form of slight. I simply mean that some people enjoy varying degrees of digestibility in their stories, much like one enjoys different levels of hotness in spicy foods. With such a large cast and perplexing tale presented over dozens of hours, 13 Sentinels will undoubtedly experience some attrition of its audience. Although, as a side note, over 58% of players earned the PSN trophy for completing the narrative, so that should give some idea of how good the story is, as most games do not see anywhere near that level of completion. In the beginning, 13 Sentinels explores the simple motive of saving the world from an invading force of aliens. 13 high school students find themselves with the ability to summon giant mecha suits called Sentinels, and while everyone else is running to safety, these heroes charge the other way. On the surface, this plot is nothing special, and in fact, I initially had concerns that the amazing narrative I'd heard so much about might be nothing more than your average shonen anime tale. Boy, was I proven so wrong. What begins as a fairly straightforward heroes save the world narrative will transform into something greater, deeper, and, of course, existential. But before I go off the rails, I want to get a few things cleared up. First, 13 Sentinels is filled with tropes. Filled. If there's a trope, it's in here. I bring this up because the gut reaction to some might be to disregard these plot points because of how overused and cliché they can be in anime or JRPGs. Don't do this. Yes, the tropes are there, but they are much more interesting than the game will let on at first. Example, several of the characters have amnesia. Boring, right? Seen this before, right? I can say with pretty good confidence that you have not seen it used in this manner, or how and why some characters experience it. Is it still a trope? Yes, absolutely. But that doesn't mean you won't become invested in it. Second, this narrative is extremely disjointed in its presentation. The game expects you to keep track of events and what people said dozens of hours previously. It expects you to reference the in-game wiki if you forget. If the story played out in a straightforward method, it would still be good, but it wouldn't be nearly as amazing. Part of the joy is piecing everything together, so if you find yourself confused after 5 or 6 hours, or let's be honest, even later, hang in there. The journey is well worth it. With those items out of the way, let's talk about this beast. The structure of 13 Sentinels jumps back and forth between eras and tones. One minute I'm in the 1940s wondering when the Americans will bomb my hometown, and the next walking the streets of a 1985 Japanese district chatting about the cute boy I bumped into earlier in the day. While these two examples sound like I cherry-picked extremes, believe me when I say that I didn't. Part of the game's charm is the slice-of-life conversations these kids have with each other, juxtaposed with the ever-looming knowledge that the end of the world is just beyond the horizon. In fact, the game opens with the final battle about to start. There is no mystery in the destination, only how did the characters get to that point, and what happens after. This backdrop of failure dangles in front of the player like a carrot, egging the player to open just one more sequence in hopes of dropping another puzzle piece into place. Only 13 Sentinels has hundreds and hundreds of pieces to put together. Just when I thought I figured something out, the game slapped me in the face with another clue about something greater, something that recontextualizes everything that I thought I understood. Again, going back to my example of amnesia, there were several points I thought I fully understood why this happened and how it could be rectified, and every single time, I got told new information that upended what I thought. The best way I can describe how the narrative unfolds is a fractal. You know those mathematical images that always create more of itself no matter how much you zoom in or out? Yeah, that's the story. A constant state of metamorphosis, a constant state of tricking the player into thinking they reach the end of a branch, only to discover that branch stretches unto infinity. But complexity for complexity's sake does not make a good story. Several years ago, I finished a rough draft of a fantasy novel. I crafted the world, mechanics, legends, monsters, and characters. Everything fell into place in my mind, but the feedback I got from editors and readers was they wanted to see more of the characters and less of the world they existed in. The legend of an amazing magic user is cool and all, but what about the people front and center? What are they doing? I bring all of this up because 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, despite its interweaving background tapestries, concentrates on its characters in the best way possible. Clicks within the high school matter, despite a mech getting summoned in the previous scene, or the latest single from an idol warrants a closer look, even though someone just had a full-on conversation with a cat. Because each of the 13 main characters gets screen time, they all become interesting and developed in their own right. Even ones I didn't particularly care for from the perspective of one person ended up garnering large amounts of sympathy for me after seeing events from their side. I genuinely enjoyed the company of some of these people. The interactions between friends felt like real relationships. Conflicts arising from opposing ideals ran like verbal chess matches between characters. I wanted these people to be happy, but the circumstances and stakes simply wouldn't allow success for everyone. When I finally put the controller down, I got the itch to start it all over, much like I did with Yakuza Like a Dragon. In my review of that game, I stated how I looked forward to simply being around Ichiban and the gang. They were delightful people with interesting stories to tell. I felt like I really knew them, and I wanted to guide them to the best of my abilities. 13 Sentinels falls right into this same groove. The majority of your time playing will be in these visual novel sections, and while story fatigue can happen depending on how one chooses to proceed, I generally looked forward to whatever new sequence headed my way. If you're a fan of media that asks its audience to really pay attention to each and every line of dialogue, 13 Sentinels will hit the mark. If you want something more streamlined with more gameplay, I recommend looking elsewhere. But again, keep in mind that most people who start this game finish it. That speaks a lot. Okay, now I'm going to delve into some spoilers, so skip ahead to the timestamp on screen if you wish to avoid that. This next section is primarily aimed at people who have either played the game already or don't ever plan on touching it. Also, please like, subscribe, and comment if you've made it this far. It really helps out the channel. So, the story is pretty wild, and there's a lot I could touch on, but I'll try to stick to only a few themes I found interesting. In 13 Sentinels, humanity is long dead, millions of years dead. This shocking revelation is dropped toward the end of the game, but subtle hints are given in the latter quarter or so. The events that unfold in the game are part of a simulation that's gone awry. This alone is pretty interesting, but the part I really thought about after completing the game was the scope of humanity's death and rebirth. Here's a brief synopsis of what happens in 13 Sentinels, so we have a jumping off point. As a species, we, of course, wipe ourselves out. Not by nukes, but by nanomachines. When the end is abundantly clear, a select group of individuals develop a way for humanity to persist into the distant future via terraforming and birth by DNA alone. Probes are sent across the galaxy. When a probe enters a solar system with resources, the probe replicates itself and continues onward. If they locate a suitable planet for terraforming, they set up the necessary resources for automated factories, which in turn produce machines that can terraform. Millions of years later, after the planet has changed enough, a system to create humans from DNA begins, and eventually, fully formed humans can walk into a new world. It has a very similar ring to Horizon Zero Dawn, which is not a bad thing. As I stated previously, when a planet reaches the proper stage to support human life, humans are created from a cache of DNA. As they grow up, these humans are plugged into an AI-run simulation that will help them prepare for the harsh task of restarting humanity. Different people are placed in different eras to develop a healthy gamut of viewpoints and a good understanding of humanity's history. Once this development is completed, the humans are released, and the real journey can begin. This is basically who the 13 protagonists are. Real people plugged into a simulation designed to teach them what they need to know. However, in 13 Sentinels, these humans never make it out of the simulation phase and are restarted numerous times due to interference on multiple levels. These restarts sometimes carry forth subtle changes in the subconscious and conscious minds of the individuals involved. After many restarts, a few figure out a way to escape the simulation and venture into the real world. Basically, they change things subtly over a long period of time through a bizarre form of nanomachine-led reincarnation. There's a ton more to this plot, but I want to keep it simple for brevity purposes. Anyway, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that 13 Sentinels' story is a bit like another JRPG series I enjoy, Xenosaga. Now, spoilers for Xenosaga 1 through 3 in case someone happens to be playing through a nearly 20-year-old series, which, if you haven't played it, I do recommend checking it out. Without going into too much detail, at the end of Xenosaga Episode 3, the main intergalactic civilization formed over thousands of years suddenly loses the ability to travel and communicate faster than life. The repercussions of this, obviously, cannot be understated. Xenosaga carries a very strong theme of the unconscious versus conscious and how that relates to an eternal cycle of rebirth. Much like 13 Sentinels, the main characters of Xenosaga are not unique, but instead a reincarnation of important figures in the universe's past. For an untold number of times, Xenosaga's universe has been restarted as a form of self-preservation. However, in the story told through the games, enough subtle changes to the subconsciousness of the universe has led to an unexpected rebellion against this cycle, which results in the aforementioned loss of FTL travel and communication. It also left the series on a gigantic cliffhanger that I'm not in any way bitter about after more than 15 years of wondering what the hell happened to everyone. 13 Sentinels is not far off this same narrative structure, except I feel it's several layers more complex to think about because of one key factor: the self-replicating probes. While the game I played is the tale of one generation out of countless failures, it is also one planet, aka one probe that found a viable planet. There could be hundreds or thousands of these same struggles occurring throughout the galaxy. Because the interference in the AI program was present in the very first probe to be sent out, theoretically, every single successful terraforming leads to a mini-universe of restarts. This means the struggles and trials faced by the player are merely a drop in the galactic ocean. When put in this perspective, the stakes of saving humanity kind of dissipate. Odds are actually pretty good that one of these probes fully completed its mission already by the time our heroes finally escaped the simulation. It doesn't mean the stakes were low for the characters involved, but it does mean other copies or clones on another planet have full-blown civilizations running around by the time the heroes get started. When this thought first entered my mind, I felt deflated, like all the effort I put into rescuing these teenagers was not that important. But the more I thought about it, the more I appreciated the writing. Despite the immense scale of success, I found myself completely attached to these iterations of humanity. It didn't matter if another set got the job done, I wanted to see these 13 people succeed. I cared about the threat of a reset, of losing all the connections they had made. Saying all that, the game actually addresses this thought experiment with a scene added to the end of the timeline under the analysis section. The title of this scene is Infinite Possibilities and shows what could be occurring in another simulation. It's clear the scenario writers thought this possibility through, and to me, what makes it even more interesting is this additional scene appears to take place right after the ending of 13 Sentinels. This implies that in humanity's desperate bid for survival, we created a system which might never end. It's not that these infinite cycles are occurring all at once. No, they are constantly starting and ending. These 13 teenagers will always struggle against an AI bug and either win or lose.
You've done well, children of mankind.
Which brings me to the next idea I found interesting, the value and measurement of human life. Now, I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to what a human life is worth or what determines if someone is truly human. What I want to look at arises from the two ideas brought up in the ending of the game. First is something I just discussed, the heroes constantly dying and reviving over countless iterations and light years of space. Does this devalue them? Are each of them truly human if they are born from machines an infinite number of times? Normally, when something is mass-produced in an identical fashion, the value of that object is reduced. It's why a Picasso painting is worth more than a JPEG of the same painting. It's also why NFT apes inherently have no value. This ponderance doesn't even consider whether, as some believe, humans have souls. Would every single iteration be non-human because they are born from a cache of DNA? If the soul is unique to each individual, what does that mean for all these clones? Again, these are interesting questions to think about while playing or when finished. Did humanity truly survive, or is this some sort of fragmented version floating around the cosmos? And this leads me to my second musing after watching the ending. What about all the AI people they mentioned turning into organic matter? There are a few lines in the ending which indicate all the AI-controlled people in the simulation, over 1 million, will be able to step into the real world by using the pods which created the 13 heroes. I'm assuming this process would take an absurd amount of time, but even if I granted it to be nearly instantaneous, what does this mean? Discussing this makes me immediately think of the dense movies and series related to Ghost in the Shell. In these properties, the question of what is the difference between AI and the essence of humanity is constantly posed. Here, the line is even more blurred. If AI people could become born into actual fleshy bodies, are they still AI? Did they go from AI to human? Were they human all along? Does this mean humans are simply a type of AI? How do the 13 heroes play into all this? Are they getting told they're human, but the entire project to save humanity is actually machine-led? The other possibility to this? Everything is a simulation. When discussing whether our reality is a simulation, there is a theory which states, if a civilization can create a simulation indistinguishable from reality, odds are good that civilization is already living in a simulation. Why? Because if one simulation is possible, there are more than likely many simulations running, which means, more than likely, any given civilization was not the progenitor one. This nifty chart helps to clarify, so feel free to pause. So, considering 13 Sentinels' world can actually harbor and run several simulations at once, and simulations within simulations, odds are pretty good that all of the events in the game take place within a simulation. You can see how this rabbit hole dives deeper and deeper, much like how I described this story as a fractal earlier in the video. I've merely touched on a few subjects presented just from the ending of the game. There is a lot more to discuss if one decided to scrutinize the plot beat by beat. Which leads me to my last discussion point on 13 Sentinels, how cohesive it is when examined. A lot of stories that push the boundaries of narrative structure don't withstand the weight of their own complexity. If one looks closely, the flaws begin to show, the connective tissues not nearly as strong as they appear from afar. 13 Sentinels is a rare breed of story where that doesn't really happen. Now, I do have a caveat to that statement. I have not personally examined every single story beat. That would take an absurd amount of time and energy. But what I have looked at and what the 13 Sentinels community has looked at seems to hold up. Events that appear to conflict with other portions of the narrative actually make sense when pursued to the fullest extent. Again, this game is not going to hold the player's hand and point out every breadcrumb along the trail. It wants the player to explore and piece together at their own pace. Even the ending of the game could be potentially very confusing and unsatisfactory if the player didn't put in the work to connect enough of the plot pieces. One could say this is a fault of the presentation and scenario writer, but I don't think that's the case. Some stories are inherently more complex, inherently more difficult to understand, and that doesn't mean the storyteller didn't know what they were doing. In conclusion to my narrative discussion, I just have one thing to say. 13 Sentinels is a masterpiece of science fiction. Full stop. I believe it can go toe-to-toe with some of the best science fiction in any medium, and is easily my favorite sci-fi tale in video games. While its structure may be off-putting to some, it will entirely engage those that stick around. Its characters are well-defined, its world is fascinating, its presentation is unrelenting. If you take away nothing else from my review, I want you to know this story is something special to the video game industry and deserves to be held in the same breath as other titles like Nier Automata, The Last of Us, Silent Hill 2, Telltale's The Walking Dead, or Gone Home. Well, we made it. This was a bit of a long review, and it took me quite a while to get the script where I wanted it to be, but here we are. In case you couldn't pick up on it, I love this game. It's not perfect, no game ever will be perfect, but its flaws add up to a very minor blemish on an otherwise outstanding product. As with anything, it won't be for everyone, but if you've made it this far into the review, odds are you're the person this game is for. It's a meaty, narrative-focused sci-fi romp with some light RTS tactical combat on the side. I really hope Vanillaware continues this trend of amazing characters and writing into its future titles. I've always been a fan of their work, but they made something really special with this title, and they deserve a lot more credit in fans than they have already garnered with their previous works. Once again, I highly recommend 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Have yourself a good one.
I'm going to believe in myself now. Mom, Dad, Miwa-chan and the rest. I can do it. I can protect you all.
Everything is a complete blank. Why am I here? I don't even remember my own name.
This time, it will be different. This time, it's my turn to save you.
So we'll do what we have to do. Get in the robots and fight. Our fate was sealed a long time ago.
Whenever you're in trouble, I'll always be there. And if it ever looks grim, I'll be the first to take a bullet for you.
If you knew the world was gonna end in a couple of minutes, how would you spend them?
Well, I can't really get anywhere in a few minutes. So I guess I'd spend them with you.
Well, guess that's that. Let's call it a day and go home.